Hi everybody, just a quick note. In the last 5 minutes of this episode, we talk a little bit about acupuncture. I know that needles going into people's places isn't everyone's cup of tea, so if you get a little squeamish or whatever and just don't like it, then maybe punch out about 5 minutes before the end. There's some good stories, but they do involve needles going into people. So, fairly warned be ye, says I, and now on with the show. Hello and welcome to Lexitecture, a podcast about word origins and histories. My name is Ryan, and in each episode my friend Amy and I bring a new pair of words to share their stories with each other and you. You can find our past episodes and the occasional blog post on our website at lexitecture.com. Follow along with us on Twitter and Facebook at Lexitecture, and if you really like what we do, you can support the show at patreon.com/lexitecture. Today's episode, Hypocrisy Bias.
Once we get to talk about some words.
I guess we probably should. Go for it.
I feel like I've gone first
Okay.
a lot, but yeah, I'm happy to go. So I'm having a little chortle to myself as we were talking about your great Android bias.
Yeah.
Because the word that I'm going to talk about today is bias.
Oh, nice.
B-I-A-S.
Yeah, okay, cool.
Yeah. And when you... Now, I quite oppositely, I came upon this word in a slightly oblique sort of way.
Okay.
Because, well, I said to you earlier, I was very much distracted while I was doing the research for this word because I had started listening to Seeing White by John Bewan, the Scene on Radio podcast, that those of you that haven't heard Ryan absolutely extol every single virtue possible about this podcast, he's been telling me I should listen to it for a long time now, and he was so right. He was right and writer. So please make space in your podcast listening life for
It's
this.
so good.
Oh my god, it's outstanding. I'm only I think I'm on episode 4. But the last episode ended with his friend, Chenderai, talking about he said something. He's outstanding.
He is.
You know, he's like Virgil guiding Bewan through the underworld.
Absolutely.
You know, and it's but he said something along the lines of, you know, it isn't fun for me to have to say these things, but having wound our way through how whiteness as a concept came to exist and why whiteness as a concept came to exist, he says, you know, whiteness has never been about anything other than oppression.
Yeah.
So if you identify with being white, then you have to think about those things. You have to kind of square that with yourself. And he basically says to John Bewan, you know, I feel sorry for you because, you know, you have some hard things to navigate.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember that line of his.
And then there was this silence, and it was like, shit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. So I'm very, very much enjoying it. And as much as I keep getting the rage, and when I'm driving, as I was saying, I'll often listen to podcasts in my car, and when I'm driving, sometimes rage and driving are not a great mix.
That's right.
Anyway, so I found myself a little bit short of research time, and I was practicing what I like to refer to as the I Love Lamp Lexitecture research technique.
Yes. I know it well.
Whereby you literally look around the room and see what words you can see and think, are any of these words interesting? And I was eating some crisps.
Okay.
So I thought about the word crisp. And so the word crisp, I hope you're laughing because you do the same thing.
I do exactly the same thing.
Either that or you're laughing at my extreme non-academic, non-serious
Oh, goodness,
to
no.
this
No.
so-called work that we do. So what I discovered about the word crisp, I wasn't super interested in the word crisp as it transpired, but crisp took me to a PI route, which took me to bias.
Oh, really?
So Etym Online has the entry for Etym Online for crisp adjective here, which is not quite, you know, the potato chip thing that I was eating, but we got there. It says Old English crisp, curly, crimped, wavy, of hair or wool, etc. From Latin crispus, curled, wrinkled, having curly hair. From pyroot, S-K-E-R, scare.
Okay.
And then after that pyroot, it has brackets to turn or bend. Now, you know how I love a pyroot. So I clicked on scare and discovered that the second sense, to turn or to bend, gave us words like crisp. But also there's the first meaning of the word scare.
Okay.
Etymonline has it defined as a Proto-Indo-European root meaning to cut.
Okay.
Now, excuse me, I'll put my teeth in. It forms all or part of, and bias is the very first word in that list. I'm going to come back to this list in a minute, but let's take a little look at bias. So, off I went to the OED. There have been more tales, dear listener, of sketchy access to the online OED. And, oh my goodness, do we love this online resource or do we love this online resource?
We do.
It's just fantastic. Yeah, we do. So, bias, adjective, noun and adverb. The etymology given in the OED is from French, biais, B-I-A-I-S, in 14th century, which means oblique or obliquity. It comes through various European versions of that. It was of Old Catalan, Sardinian, Latin, etc. I did enjoy this. I did enjoy this sentence. I thought you would like it. It says here, the conjecture of Diez that it is from Latin bifax, bifacem, explained by Isidore as duos habens obtutus, or looking two ways, is rejected by later Romanic scholars as phonetically untenable.
Oh, harsh.
So there, you're phonetically untenable.
It's a sick OED burn right there.
Yes, precisely that. So it was originally an adjective, as in the Provençal via biasia, a cross or oblique road, but it's early used as a noun in French, so that the first quotable example in English is of the substantive use. So, interesting times with bias, and the first sense given is that bias means slanting or oblique.
Okay.
A bias line in geometry was the word that was used for a diagonal line or a hypotenuse.
Oh, really?
So
okay.
We have from 1551, by the bias line I mean that line which in any square figure doeth run from corner to corner.
Right. Okay.
So, interesting. We then get into the what's the word I'm after? The notion of material, fabric.
Okay.
So in dresses, bias cut means to cut across the texture of the cloth or slanting.
Okay.
And we get various later citations for that. So we have 1815, 1883, 84, talking about clothing and describing how this particular garment has been cut. Then we have this really interesting one, sense number 2, swelled as the bowl on the bias side. Now that quotation comes from Johnson. And a bowl, as in a carpet bowl, has
like B-O-L-E?
a flat side and a curved side.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, B-O-W-L.
Okay.
Like lawn bowls, carpet bowls.
Okay.
Yeah, so we have this sense. So the later sense we get here, a term at bowls, applied alike to the construction or form of the bowl imparting an oblique motion, the oblique line in which it runs, and the kind of impetus given to cause it to run obliquely. Thus, a bowl is said to have a wide or narrow bias, to run with a great or a little bias, and the player can give it more or less bias in throwing it. And this interesting note here. It's difficult to decide in which sense exactly bias was here used first. A priori, we think of the oblique line of motion. This is favoured also by the quotations under C. Yet early quotations here point rather to the oblique one-sided structure or shape of the bowl. Formerly, bias was given by loading the bowls on one side with lead, and this itself was sometimes called the bias. They are now made of very heavy wood, teak or ebony, and the bias given entirely by their shape, which is that of a sphere slightly flattened on one side and protuberant on the other, as if composed of the halves of an oblate and a prolate spheroid. Aside from the fact that the words oblate and prolate spheroid are just really, really good, fun, pleasing words to say, we have this sense of bias The first OED citation is from 1570. So only 20 years after the sense of the diagonal oblique line, we have this term at bowls. So it does seem that we have the sense of which came first, the bowl or the or the diagonal, if you like, which I thought was quite interesting. So we have lots and lots of bowls related terms and quotations, and then we have it travelling only in, well, the earliest here is 1586 into that figurative sense. So the notion of moving sideways or being oblique. To be a bowl for every alley and run into every company proves thy mind to have no bias, from 1618. So it's interesting how quickly the figurative sense has arisen from this very practical, directional, shape-based concept. And then we come to sense 3. An inclination, leaning, tendency, bent, a preponderating disposition or propensity, predisposition towards, predilection or prejudice. The first questionable citation, I'm not sure if the question is of the date or of this sense within that quotation. We have Detection Mary Queen of Scots. She cometh to her own bias and openly sheweth her own natural conditions. So we have here this sense of a person's character demonstrating or showing bias, that oblique movement sense. And we then get in 1768, the first time that we talk about, that the law will not suppose a possibility of bias or favour in a judge. And then continuing with that bias towards evil, a bias in favour of the Irish, that sort of thing. So very much the meaning that we would tend to give it as we talk about apple versus Android.
Right, yeah.
Further meanings, we have a statistical definition, a systematic distortion of an expected statistical result due to a factor not allowed for in its derivation, also a tendency to produce such distortion, so a mathematical or statistical bias. And then 4, to set course in any direction, ordinary way, from or out of the bias, out of the way, to put out of or off of one's bias, to put out, disconcert, confuse, or put into disorder. This is an obsolete sense of the word, but I quite like it. From 1588, we have, mark what will be the issue if you still keep your old bias. So this sense that you can be kind of shifted out from your bias. And my goodness, we go on and on and on. So number 5, we have a swaying influence, impulse or weight, anything which turns a man to a particular course or gives the direction to his measures. And then we have a centre of gravity, that's given us as a rare meaning. And we have telegraphy, which refers you to the quotation here from 1940, which states, bias, the adjustment of a telegraph relay so that it operates for currents greater than a given current against which it is biased, or for a current of one polarity. Now, as you know, I'm a technical genius, so clearly I understood every single word of that. Definitely know what the telegraphical sense of bias is
Absolutely clear as day, yeah.
Clear as day. And then finally, number 7, we have a steady voltage or current applied to an electronic device.
Oh, that's interesting.
Bias, steady direct voltage applied between the cathode and control electrode of a thermionic tube in order to determine its working point. From 1960, H. Carter, Dictionary of Electronics. Not in any way gobbledygook to me.
No,
definitely not.
I got all that too. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's in there. If I need it again, I can just call on that knowledge for sure.
You know what someone listening to this just said? You idiots.
Dear idiots.
That's right. Somebody's saying that right now.
They really are. I kind of feel like that might be the case at any given point. Someone enough. Somewhere is saying dear idiots. Yeah. So bias running from an oblique line, a diagonal line, all the way into these various different definitions, various different meanings. However, I can't get away from that wonderful list of cognates from scare, Proto-Indo-European root meaning to cut. So, listen to this.
I'm excited.
It forms all or part of bias, carnage, carnal, carnation, carnival, carnivorous, carrion, scenical, charcuterie, charnel, corium, cortex, crone, cuirass, courier, curt, decorticate, excoriate, incarnadine, incarnate, incarnation, kirtle, scabbard, scar, scaramouche,
Oh,
scarf, scarp, score, scrabble, scrap, scrape, screen, screw, scrimmage, scrofula, scrub as in a tree, scurf, shard, share, sharp, shear, EAR, and shear, EER, shirt, shore, short, shrub, scary, skirmish, and skirt. A couple of notable
oh
inclusions
man.
there that I felt it was negligent of me not to investigate. So the first of them, incarnadine,
Okay.
purely because I'd never seen it before, and a little bit because it made me think of Kill Bill. Is it David Carradine?
Yes,
Kill
yeah.
Bill? One of the Carradines, anyway. So we have in Etym Online here a citation from 1590s. It means flesh-coloured, carnation-coloured, pale red or pink. From French incarnadine, 16th century. From dialectical Italian incarnadino, flesh-coloured. From late Latin incarnatio, as in incarnation. The adjective now is archaic or obsolete, which is a shame as far as
Yeah.
I'm concerned. So the next time something pale pink or pale red or pink needs my description, I may well describe it as incarnadine.
Yeah.
However,
Maybe not as
know-
maybe not describing it as universally flesh colored.
no, that's problematic for a whole load of reasons.
Yeah. But pale pink is fine. That's
Maybe.
good. Yeah.
Yeah. So then, of course, we come to Scaramouche.
Yes.
Scaramouche, will you do the fandango?
Super glad. Yeah. Okay.
And it occurred to me that not only, I mean, it's a wonderful word, it comes under the Buddy the Elf criteria of that's a fun word to
That sure
say.
is.
And this is what Etym Online has to say about it. 1660s, name of a cowardly braggart, supposed by some to represent a Spanish Don, in traditional Italian comedy. From Italian scaramuccia, literally skirmish,
Oh,
from
okay.
schermire to fence. And according to the OED, it was a vogue word in the late 17th century London, probably due to the popularity of the Italian actor Tiberio Furelli, who played this part in an Italian comedy.
Huh.
So Scaramouche, Scaramouche, will you do the fandango? He may well have done if it was called for in the drama.
Nice.
So from Scaramouche to skirmish, all the way back to scare, and then to, it seems rather unlikely that bias could be from this same place.
Yeah.
So here's how it comes. It comes to be
Okay.
related to this scare. Probably it came to French from Old Provençal billet, which has cognates in Old Catalan and Sardinian, and is possibly via Vulgar Latin. And we have here a word, the E is in brackets. Presumably the E is either optional or it's a form that perhaps dropped away as Latin became more vulgar. We have ebigasius, Ebigassius, from Greek epikarsios,
Oh,
which means
okay.
athwart,
There's that car.
crosswise, or at an angle. Yeah. So the epi, meaning upon, and karsios, meaning oblique. From pi, now this is just a collection of letters, I don't know how to pronounce them. We have KRS-yo-, which is a suffixed form of the root scare,
Right.
to cut.
Okay.
So from epikarsios, we get to ebigasios. From ebigasios, we get to bigasius, which makes its way through these various French, Catalan, Sardinian, Provençal, delightful ways to give us bias.
That's fantastic. I like that we got it because it's such a different formation. Like everything else keeps that hard C
Scar,
and
sort
R
of.
combination. Either it's cur or car. Sometimes with the S, sometimes without. But the R, as I'm sure that fans of Scottish brogue will no doubt be replaying that list over and over and over and over and over again, because it's the perfect thing for a Scottish person to sit to read off because of the R's. There's just so many. And then bias is just there in the middle of their just kind of, hey guys, I'm here too. But that route, that track makes sense because you heard that car in the Greek and then it sort of you can kind of watch it dwindling
Yeah.
as it goes, and then it finally so that
Which is very satisfying, and you know there isn't always such a clear path. So when there is a path like that, I really enjoy it.
oh, absolutely, it's way more satisfying than I was thinking it was going to be, because I was thinking it was going to be one of those things where you're just like, we don't know how it got here. Here it is. I'm like, oh, but I want to know.
Yeah, there are plenty of those out there in the etymological swamps.
There sure are. Very cool. Bias.
I don't know. Is etymology a swamp, or is it a desert, or is it a mine?
Oh, I think it's a swamp.
I might have to think about that.
I think it's a swamp.
Swamp.
There's a lot of
Here be dragons.
here there be dragons. There's a lot of messiness. The roots are all entangled with each other, and you can't ever tell which plant is which. And yeah, I feel like swamp is pretty.
Yeah.
It's pretty accurate.
And some of it smells bad.
And a lot of it smells bad. Yeah. Cool.
Cool.
Neat. Okay. Well, my word today is a word. It's sort of, this is an interesting one because I don't remember how I got the kind of thought to look this up, but so the word is hypocrisy or hypocrite.
Ooh, nice.
And I kind of, when I looked it up, I realized that I didn't actually know what it meant. Like, it's a really common word. It's used all the time, mostly in politics, strangely enough, but it's, yeah, it's used all the time. And I thought I would have said, of course I know what that word means. But so, and maybe I'm just, sometimes you get into one of those things where your brain kind of gets wrapped up in a really, really sort of subtle and possibly not even there, maybe imaginary distinction between two understandings of a word or a concept. I think this may be where I am, and you can tell me if I am there. So my sense of a hypocrite is someone whose stated position and actions are completely at odds or reverse, like they're polar opposites from each other.
Yeah,
so,
I think that sounds reasonable. Yeah.
And so I think what my internal definition of hypocrisy was that the hypocrisy lay specifically in the contradiction between action and belief, or stated belief and actual belief, or those kind of things. Like, it needed that contradiction, and it wasn't until someone acted in a way that was contrary to their stated beliefs that they became a hypocrite, if that makes sense. Does that sound?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
So
you've got me scrabbling through my very rudimentary Greek to think about what this word may actually mean. So I'm really curious.
We'll get there. So the actual dictionary.com definition of hypocrite is a person who pretends to have virtues, moral or religious beliefs, principles, etc., that he or she does not actually possess, especially a person whose actions belie stated beliefs. So there's that last part, is sort of like where I had hung all of my definition of hypocrisy. But I read that and I was kind of like, oh, so it's the act of pretending to have those beliefs in the first place, not that you necessarily have to have acted against them.
Contradict them.
You can be an unknown, you can be a hypocrite before anyone knows you're a hypocrite, is basically what I hadn't thought of for some reason. And that, anyway. So the OED defines this sense of hypocrite as the assuming of a false appearance of virtue or goodness with dissimulation of real character or inclinations, especially in respect to religious life or beliefs, hence, in a general sense, dissimulation, pretense, sham, also an instance of this. Okay. So that's how the OED defines hypocrisy. Smith, in Smith's Synonyms Discriminated, I got an email from someone who I was asking about, it was like, who is the Smith's guy, and who is the Smith guy, and can I read anything by him? So I looked into, he apparently has written nothing else of major, or at least nothing else that's lasted as long as his work that I'm constantly referencing and I'm slightly obsessed by, called Synonyms Discriminated, which is late 1700s, early 1800s. Smith was, and the problem is that his name is Charles John Smith, so it's like three of the most common names in the history of the English naming convention. So he was
I get that.
Yeah. He was a
oh, sorry, on you go. Do this first.
Oh no, I was just going to say he was a priest, a reverend at one point, who wrote this book called Synonyms Discriminated, where he basically is quibbling with the idea that these words are in fact synonyms by pointing out the ways that they differ from each other. And it's a
In
fantastically
the most
nerdy,
beautiful, whimsical
and
way.
the way, and it's his writing that I have always loved, because the first time I read it, it was just like, yes, I need this in my life. So, Smith's summary of hypocrite is a hypocrite is a false pretender to virtue or piety, and is a dissembler as to one half of his character, that is, as to being what he pretends not to be, but not as to the other, namely, the not being what he pretends to be. Hypocrisy, it has been observed, is the homage which vice pays to virtue, an idea which is only expanded in the following. Hypocrisy is a more modest way of sinning. It shows some reverence to religion, and owes so far the worst-hand excellency of it, as to acknowledge that it deserves to be counterfeited. I mangled that sentence, but the idea that I thought that was such a cool, like, this idea that it's,
I have such a Smith crush.
absolutely, it shows some reverence to religion, and owed so far own the wart-hand excellency of it, as to acknowledge that it deserves to be counterfeited.
That's
Which
so
is,
great.
it's such a
What I was going to say, I heard, a good few years ago, I heard a wonderful, wonderful performer on the radio one night on the Mark Radcliffe Folk Show, which goes out on BBC Radio 2, used to be on BBC Radio 2. And I heard this absolutely fantastic singer-songwriter playing the guitar. And I knew that he was an English folk singer, folk performer. And what I remembered was that I absolutely loved it, and that he had a very common name. That was it. That was all I had.
Oh, good.
And I'd listened out carefully at the end of the track so that Mark Radcliffe could tell me who this absolute voice of an angel beyond, who this artist could be. And I really thought I'd remembered it. But what I actually remembered was that he had a really common name. And eventually, after a lot of really frustrating Googling, I discovered that he's called John Smith.
Oh, good. That'll make everything easier.
So, yeah, his website is johnsmith.com, which makes things a little bit easier. Please look him up, because he's absolutely glorious. But anyway, yes, Smith crush. Smith crush number 2.
Yeah, well, so many Smith crushes. Yeah, so that idea that it's the pretense of religious or virtue or whatever. So it's really old. It started in the early 1200s, coming from French,
Okay.
which didn't actually have the H at the beginning, and so it was.
Okay.
It sounds, you cannot but pronounce it with a French accent. Hypocrite.
Hypocrite.
And so
Sorry, French people. Sorry.
I think they know. Like I grew up in Northern Ontario with a huge Francophone population, and my dad was an audiologist, so he made fitted people with hearing aids and prescribed hearing aids and stuff. And he had a secretary, office administrator who was French Canadian, and with a very thick French Canadian accent. And the French Canadian accents of a certain strain have a tendency to do really funny things with H's. If there's an H in a word, they will get rid of it. If there is no H but a vowel, they will put an H there, and that's where they use up all their extra H's that they lopped off the front of words that have H's. And so,
very economical.
And so, to hear her speak on the phone, what my dad actually prescribed and fitted people with were earring aids.
Earring aids.
Instead of hearing
That's
aids,
wonderful.
it was fantastic. Anyway, so it comes from the French, hypocrite. And it is by far, like by a long way, the earliest English word, at least in writing, to have that hypo prefix. And again,
nice.
Another word that I just had no sense of this word being a word that had a prefix and a root. Like it just didn't occur. I don't know why. You look at it and it's like, of course. But that hypo
less
is in there.
Than or underneath.
It becomes important. It also took me forever to get my head around why this is there, and I might be wrong on this, so we'll get back to this in a little bit.
Oh, exciting.
But the construction of the word is very, very old. It was an ecclesiastical word, so that idea of showing a reverence to religion or putting religious beliefs on, it was always very specifically feigning religious piety was right. That idea, at least in English and French. And then as far as I can see, in ecclesiastical Latin as well. Before that, it was Greek, and it had exactly the same form. But in Greek, in Attic Greek, it meant the act of playing a part on stage, feigning or pretense. So a hypocrite was an actor. And that's what that word was. It just was the word for actor. An actor was a hypocrite.
That's amazing.
Was just a stage actor. Yeah. And so the hypo prefix, we see that in a bunch of words now. So hypothermia, lowered body temperature, hypodermic, under the skin, hypoglycemic, so having a low blood sugar. Yeah, no kidding. First day with the new lips. So under, below, low, those things. And that's where that hypo prefix comes in. And now, the crisy, the hypocrisy part, or crisis or krisis, whatever, however you pronounce Greek, I don't know, it's all Greek to me, comes from a Greek word meaning to judge or to decide. And so
now I was considering Plato in this. I think there is a work of Plato called kritos, or certainly a word that begins with that CRIT part of the word, and I couldn't think what it was. So when I said I was scrabbling around with my Greek, I couldn't quite get to that kriti part. So do tell, and I'll shut up and stop interrupting.
And so
I won't. Well, we both know I won't.
But we wouldn't want you to. No one would know what the show was. What is this? So this crisy or crisis or crisis or whatever part comes from a pi root meaning to sieve, and it leads to words like ascertain, discriminate, criterion, or excrement, which was originally just any waste discharged from the body, so as in the stuff that was sifted out.
Stuff that was filtered out.
Yeah.
Nice.
So that's where the crisy part is, to discern, ultimately to sieve, ascertain, discriminate, all that other stuff. And so I got to this point and I went, what? Because it's one of those things where someone says a sentence that is made up of words that you know, but arranged in an order that makes you think you've just woken up on a strange planet, or you've been in a coma for 50 years, and you're like, I know all of those words. Why don't I know what you're talking about?
Hypocrisy is under discernment.
Under discernment. I was like, what? So as I was sort of struggling with this, what I actually found was another very cool word. And you know how sometimes it's like the words that we have now have an obvious, or obviously had at one point, an opposite that we no longer use. So you can be disheveled,
like
but you're not going to be sheveled. Mm-hmm. You can be unkempt, but rarely is someone kempt. But at one point, presumably they were. So we've all heard the word hyperbole.
Yes.
And so hyperbole it literally means to throw over or beyond, meaning an exaggeration, right? You're chucking your rhetoric way beyond where it needs to go. So it's an exaggeration.
I love it.
But it had a counter in contrary rhetorical technique, and it was a specific term of art in rhetoric called a hypobole, or a hypobole. I'm not sure how it would have been pronounced.
You have no idea what a crazy intellectual hard-on I have for rhetorical terms.
HYPO, as opposed to hyper, like hyperglycemic, hypoglycemic.
Yeah.
Hypobole or hypobole. And a hypobole or whatever was a rhetorical technique where you preemptively countered an argument. Mm-hmm. So you were presenting, it's like, and we did this, I'm in law school for anyone who doesn't know, and in a trial...
Yeah, sure. This stuff still goes on.
Absolutely. In a trial advocacy class I took last year, we're talking about how the importance of recognizing the weaknesses in your own argument so that you can address them, get out ahead of them. It happens all over in life too. The idea is to get out ahead of something and be able to address it before it becomes weaponized against you, right? You undercut it, and that way they don't get to use it. And so this hypo was to counter that before. And it was like, it was throwing under is what the literal construction of the word is, hypo, and then the bowl was to throw. So you're throwing something under someone, and I'm thinking that maybe the sense is that because you're undermining their argument by throwing something under them and tripping them up, then maybe the hypo...
All I can think of is like marbles on the floor.
Yeah, or like you huck the rope with the two balls around it, it trips people up like you see in like Indiana Jones and old adventure movies and stuff. So that's what I was thinking for that. And then I was thinking that maybe that's where that hypo comes from, because the idea that you are undercutting someone's discernment by fooling them, by acting and playing this part and using this pretense, and maybe that's how this under judgment goes is that you're sort of undercutting someone's discernment. And that maybe that's where I don't know that that's why that's the only thing I think of that makes sense as to where underneath or below judgment or discernment could relate to acting or pretense or putting on a show or any of those things. So, I don't know if anyone has a better idea.
I suppose I'm kind of thinking about it in terms of like, you know, the phrase that you use, under the radar.
Yeah.
It's like that same sort of idea. If something is under the radar, you're not aware of it. And presumably when someone is acting, you don't want to be thinking the whole time, that guy's pretending.
Right.
She's not really that person. You know, so under discernment kind of works pretty easily for me. But I love the fact that you've investigated this with reference to hyperbole. Hyperbole?
I don't know.
Yeah.
It's hard to
hyperbole. But yeah, that's fantastic. But I also love the sense of throwing over and throwing under from those two terms.
Yeah.
But if someone is discerning, they can't be fooled. They've got this ability to check out what's good and what's not good, and to decide one way or the other. But if they are under discerning, they have that quality, but they haven't quite, they're just not using it to the full capability.
Right.
It like underperforming, that same sort of sense. That's what I was thinking when you said.
Oh, that is really interesting.
Hypo as an under, and discernment. So but then isn't it interesting that the act of fooling someone is etymologically it's put onto the fooled person, whereas hypocrisy we tend to think of as being something that is actively done by the foolee.
Yeah.
Not something that isn't noticed by the fooled. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So maybe the hypocrisy part, as far as acting goes, is that you are inspiring a lowered level of discernment on the part of your audience. That's really interesting.
You're encouraging people to be fooled.
Yeah. There was one other sort of addendum, like a coda to this, while I was looking up the hypo prefix to try to figure out what the hell I was looking at. And I the other place that hypo is used is hypochondriac. So a hypochondriac, someone who's worried all the time about being sick. And I kind of went, there's another word that this doesn't under. What is that even? What? And so I looked that up because I had to. And the hypo...
I had to.
I couldn't not.
I get
the
it.
Hypo... So the hypo still means under. And the chondria part, chondria, meant cartilage or gristle, especially that of the breastbone. And...
As in costochondritis.
Yeah.
Or
yes.
Yeah. So continue with this. Yeah, I'm just thinking out loud.
Go ahead, there, Dictionary of Electronics. So, yeah, cartilage or gristle, especially out of the breastbone. So originally, hypochondria defined, quote, a form of melancholia thought to be brought about by an excess of black bile and vapors generated by the hypochondria, which is the organs beneath the breastbone and ribcage.
Oh,
so the hypochondria were the beneath the breastbone organs, and the organs contained under the ribcage, and those organs were thought to generate excess black bile and vapors that brought along this melancholic mood and temperament. And then the people demonstrating those were hypochondriacs, and then eventually it was those. And if you're melancholy and you're moody and whatnot, you always assume you're sick, and that morphed that way. But it all comes from the hypochondria. Originally was the collection of organs underneath your breastbone.
I swear, if I had a gong, I'd be dinging it. That is tremendous.
Isn't that awesome?
Oh my god, so great!
It was really cool.
I tell you what else. I'm currently beginning my humble studies into traditional Chinese medicine.
Okay.
While I was away in Edinburgh the other week, I had my first ever acupuncture lesson.
Oh, okay.
Which my teacher showed me how to put needles in a hand, and then I put needles in my hand, and and then I spent the rest of the day going, I put needles in my hand. But I'm very, very excited about acupuncture and about TCM, and actually being able to do it to another person is a long, long, long way down the line. if that's ever, where the line goes. But I've started reading a really, really wonderful book that is the sort of quintessential introduction to traditional Chinese medicine, with a view to then my next book that I'm going to read is all about Korean hand acupuncture, or Korean hand therapy, and the book that I'm reading at the moment is called The Web That Has No Weaver, and it largely starts off by pointing out that the system of traditional Chinese medicine and East Asian medicine is so very different from the Western model of medical health wellness stuff, and it's it's much more complicated than I'm going to be able to accurately describe in a 5-minute bit talking about it, but this notion of balance, the web, rather than looking at a disease as something that is external and comes into the body,
right,
everything is about how everything else relates to everything else.
Right.
So things being out of balance, too much heat, or too much dampness, or not enough qi, these are the things that create the conditions whereby things don't work as well as they could be working. And it's fascinating because the writer of the book, a guy called Ted Kapchuk, he's very much got a foot in both worlds. I think he's a neuroscientist, but he's also an expert in traditional Chinese medicine. So he's very well aware of these two different systems and how they generally work. And what he's saying is they're not equivalent, they're different. They're completely different ways of looking at a body, an organism, a person.
Right.
And here's how these different things work. But the notion of the organs underneath the chondria, costochondritis is an infection of the bones and the cartilage of the rib cage. It's very painful.
Sounds like it.
And it's one of these things that comes on without very much prompting if you tend to be prone to it.
Right. Well, now I'm scared that I'm going to get that. Thank you very much.
Well, maybe you have too much black blood underneath.
I guess
your sternum.
so. Jeez. All the vapors.
Yeah, the vapors, man.
It's the acupuncture story. My cousin married a fantastic woman who was at the time has become a naturopath. They started dating when she was in school for it. And one of the stories I told at their wedding was when I knew that they were going to be okay, like they were going to be, this was it, was when she told me the story about how she offered to practice some acupuncture on my cousin. And he was like, well, and she's like, come on. The absolute worst thing that can happen is the needle will go too far and I'll puncture a lung. And so not only did he have her practice acupuncture on him, they are married now. So there's a union that not will be able to separate, because when you've been through that.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it's pretty great.
I have to say, my husband's response to me saying, I put needles in my hand, was, yeah, we're not doing that. No, just no.
I support you. And I love you. Get away from me.
They're tiny, tiny little itty bitty needles. They only go like a millimetre or two into the skin. It's not like traditional acupuncture, depending on where the needles go, they may be a couple of millimetres into the skin, or they may be 3 to 4 inches into the skin. It's... Yeah, I heard a wonderful story on the training. One of the guys who was there, who's a dancer, and he hurt his back and he wasn't able to dance. And the company he was working for sent him to this Chinese doctor. And he was kind of there after hours, so hustled in the back door to see this Chinese lady, and there was an interpreter, and then he was there. And so they talked about what was going on and how he'd done it and all the rest of it. And it had been a really severe back injury. He'd been unable to walk for sort of days before that, and he was beginning to get himself up and about, but he was very careful about how he was moving. And the acupuncture needles were put into his hand and his back, and then sort of unexpectedly, the doctor took a needle and inserted it into the philtrum, which is the little groove running from the bottom of your nose to the top of your lip.
Oh, that...
And he said she sort of went, just sort of ambushed. And he said, and I felt it bounce off my teeth.
Oh, thanks. I hate it.
But the very wonderful thing about that story was what happened next.
Oh, it had better end well.
Because the translator said to this guy, she wants you to dance. And I think he kind of thought, you need to get the blood moving within these points, within these meridians. So there he is in this little Chinese medicine clinic, late of an evening, only 3 people in the room, just dancing. With needles in his face.
Oh.
But it helped a great deal.
Well, that's good. I'm happy. I'm happy for him. I'm not even a needle problem guy. Like I don't get queasy if I give blood or if I have to get a shot or IVs or.
Do we need a content warning for this stuff? Maybe we do.
I'm gonna put a little thing at the beginning, I think. And that's it for another episode of Lexitecture. To get in touch with us about something you heard in this episode, you can email us at words@lexitecture.com. You can also follow along and talk to us at Lexitecture on Facebook and Twitter, and at Lexitecture Podcast on Instagram. For back episodes and the occasional blog post, visit us at lexitecture.com. Thanks very much, and we'll talk to you again soon.